Welcome along to another Westerly VR preview, race number 3.7, Series 3, race number 7. Mentmore in 69, that's 1969, and you can see we're at the start of what was the 1969 British Road Race Professional Championship course. So we're going to go down this straight, and we will go back to the map in a minute. Before I start, just before I got to the start, I came across this, which I hadn't realised, and I thought was quite interesting, that 500 Polish families for 13 years had been housed on this site that you can see in front of you. After the war, they were basically people who couldn't go back to the communist regime there and were housed in Britain. This is quite poignant for Westerly. Our origins are in Ealing in West London, which was almost the Polish capital of Britain after World War II. It was certainly an epicentre for Polish migrants escaping communism, and all of our club rides start at the Polish War Memorial that commemorates all the Poles who came over and fought with the British Air Force during the war. I hadn't realised that so many Polish refugees had been housed so far north of our normal cycling area. So where are we? We're in Mentmore, and in 1969 the Mentmore circuit, as you can see from this flash from the programme cover, tells you at 164 miles, 17 lap professional road race with the top rise in Britain at the time in 1969. But of course, in 1969, Britain wasn't the predominant road racing cyclist nation that it is today. So it was a very different sort of race. And this was the course, and it was promoted by a couple of local cycling clubs. You can't really imagine that today, can you? But back in those days, in 1969, where things were a little bit more homely, shall we say, you can see from the programme cover here that it was promoted by the Hemel Hempstead and Watford cycling clubs, sponsored by a local phonographic company, and organised Mr. L. Jordan, who even put his address on the front of the programme. You can't really imagine ASO publishing all their directors' addresses on the front of the Tour de France programme, can you? But that was those days, and of course British cycling was very, very different. And this course is quite nostalgic for a lot of reasons. There's quite a bit of British road racing history in it. There's some other historical bits and pieces that make this slightly interesting, and we'll get onto those as we go around the course. And I have to say, of all the race previews I've done for Westerly VR, this one I thought was going to be the most difficult, because most of the scenery looks like what you're looking at now. Now, there is a hill towards the end, and I have ridden these roads many, many times, not in race mode, I have to say, as an Audax or a randonneur. And I think that the hill at the end is going to be the decisive point. So get ready for it. It's not rides at the end. You go over the hill at Mentmore, and it's fast all the way home. We'll see more of that later, but most of the race previewing is going to be around that hill, which has got a little way to come. So in the meantime, we'll indulge in more British cycling history, and you'll see on your screen a nice picture of Colin Lewis winning the 1968 version of this race, of course, albeit on a different circuit, because they changed every year. That's Colin Lewis, the man from the West Country, winning the 1968 British Road Race Professional Championship. Here we are on the 1969 course, all good fun. So anyway, as you saw from the map earlier, we're going along a little bit of a straight, and then we hit this loop that they actually did 17 times in 1969 during the National Road Race Championships here in Britain, and we're going to hit that crossroads with the start line in a moment. We'll point that out. So as I say, we're only going to do one lap, plus the little starting bit of the race, which takes us up to 16 kilometres, which is basically what we do on Westerly VR races. They're 16 kilometre fast and furious races. Now, the undulations coming up, there is a railway bridge after the roundabouts that you're going to see in a moment. The roundabouts, effectively, that we're coming up to now, you can see the sign on your left. Now, this is the finishing line, but coming from our left. So when we finish, we will come down the left and cross these roundabouts, and that's essentially the finishing line. We're going to cross them here, and you can see there from that route, we've just come up the little spur on the right there, and we just hit those crossroads and we're heading north again. Now there's a couple of undulations along this stretch of road. We do go up and down a little bit, but the big hill is towards the end, so more of that later. In the meantime, let's have a look at the 1969 history. Now the Mackeson team, or one of the competing teams, there are only 5 riders, and you'll see as we go through the teams that basically professional riders who weren't in very strong teams perhaps rode solo, whereas professional riders who clubbed together in the bigger teams in Britain at that time would have had a stronger team. Look at this lineup. Colin Lewis. Now Colin Lewis was one of the great British riders of the time. Everybody from the West Country will know Colin Lewis. He had a bike shop down there after he retired. I'm sure that all you West Country people will know the name Colin Lewis. Look at number 2 in that team, Hugh Porter. Now, if you've watched any British cycling over the last 20 years or so in Britain, you will know that Hugh Porter does the commentary for the BBC. A great rider, a track riding world championship holder. Yes, Hugh Porter was in that team. And the other thing that struck me about this, and whilst we talk, here's the first undulation, is that that team, Mackeson, wore a kit very, very similar to the Westerly Cycling Club kit, which I hadn't previously realised. Unfortunately, we had to stop at the traffic lights here for a little while. So up and away again, and I'm not sure if this railway bridge will particularly notice when you're riding a Westerly VR race in a peloton. It probably won't. It's more noticeable solo or on a normal bike. Once again, looking at the Condor colours there of the day. Now Condor is this just iconic, beautiful bike shop. It's just off Holborn on Gray's Inn Road, I think, if you're ever in London. So that's in EC4 in the city. It is just one of those bike shops to visit. I only wish they had a museum underneath in the way that Plum Bikes do in Ghent. So here we are, we've hit the next turn. Unfortunately, we got held up there as well because there's a big queue of cars behind that cyclist. So once we got going, we had to catch up and accelerate with the cars. As you can see, it's not flat per se, but it's not undulating enough, I think, to cause any problems to an RGT peloton with full steam ahead in a Westerly VR race. So I don't think tactically there's a lot here, but you might see 1 or 2 riders just fall out on the odd undulation. So undulations here, but nothing I think that's going to upset a RGT peloton. Certainly not a sizable one. I think the next interesting thing that comes out of this is going to be the Great Train Robbery. Now, if you're not from Britain, you might not even have a clue what the Great Train Robbery is, or you might think it's the name of a Hollywood film or whatever. But in Britain in 1963, it was a news item that absolutely stormed the nation, where a train was stopped just along the road from where we are in the middle of the night, containing absolutely millions of pounds worth of British banknotes, and 15 to 17 guys, depending on how you read this, stole the money. And that's probably worth about £75 million, and that's heading towards $100 million US in today's money. It was a big stash, and it gripped the nation. And it took the police a long time to catch all the guys. They didn't catch all the guys, and they never got all the money back. And there have been so many films and TV films and documentaries made about this, and it dragged on for years and years and years. The notoriety of the robbers just carried on because a number of them escaped. They got out of the country, they had plastic surgery, and went elsewhere to live in the world. Some of them got recaught, some of them actually missed Britain and came back and served their jail sentences, and the story just rolls and rolls and rolls. So if you'll forgive me, if you're not from Britain and you don't know the story of the Great Train Robbers, it was a story from 1963 that rolled on for at least 20 years. And I think in the 1980s, the film Buster probably brought the memories back. Phil Collins, the famous pop music singer, rock singer, depending on your view of his music, was, of course, his starring role in there, playing Buster Edwards. Buster Edwards himself escaped abroad but came back, served his sentence, and ended up selling flowers at Waterloo Station, one of the big terminus stations in the UK. The great train robbery and British, I suppose, media interest rolled on for something like 30 odd years plus beyond the actual event. But the event itself, as I say, happened just up the road here. So you can see on screens there a picture of the morning after the actual great train robbery. The train stuck there. It was stopped because the gang replaced a green light with a red light, and the train driver stopped erroneously. The gang jumped in, the driver was hit, his injuries haunted him for the rest of his life, and the rest of the gang jumped into the carriages where this money was being shipped. As I say, something like the equivalent of £75 million today. That may or may not be heading towards $100 million US, if you want to benchmark on that. And as I say, the gang almost got away with it. I mean, it was very, very clever because they didn't actually escape too far. There's a picture of it today. You can see there's rather more trees there today. It's grown a little bit, but the gang actually hid in a local farmhouse, and it was quite clever because instead of escaping, they actually hid very, very close, and they'd hired out this farm. And essentially, the idea was that they would be very, very careful and not leave any clues. Unfortunately, like all best laid plans, the devil falls with them, and there were one or two clues, and eventually the police did find this remote farmhouse where they'd been holding up, and it began to find that they hadn't been quite as careful as they wanted. So the arrow showing you where that road is, and there's the road on the side, you can see. So just down there was that little railway bridge that we showed you. So the gang unfortunately left one or two clues. One or two people were careless. It was a gang of about 15 people in the house. They reckon there was 17 in the gang altogether, and they think they never caught one of them, and they certainly never got all the money back. And quite clearly there was a lot of money funding some of the escapes from prison from the members of the gang later on. So it kind of never really resolved itself, although most of them did end up in prison. As I say, some of the gang members weren't quite as cautious as they should have been, and the clues in the farmhouse did eventually make the whole thing unravel, and as I say, most of them got caught. And it was one of the great rolling British media stories for many, many years. People like Ronnie Biggs kept escaping, were always on the loose. Buster Edwards, Bruce Reynolds, who was the mastermind behind it. There's a whole BBC documentary, I think, made about him. It's just one of those folklore stories from British crime, politics, or whatever, that just rolled and rolled and rolled for years. So back to the cycling. As you can see, not a lot's changed in the scenery, slightly undulating, but it'll feel fairly flat in the race. Remember, we're only doing one lap. The actual cyclists in 1969 did several. Holdsworth Campagnolo. Now, Campagnolo is a name that everybody watching this will know. One of the major group set constructors, an iconic Italian brand. Holdsworth is another iconic brand, perhaps not as well known globally, but as a British brand it is very iconic, and it has been relaunched, and brand ownership has become something that Planet X have gone out and bought. So you can buy Holdsworth frames bikes that are absolutely fantastic in that traditional livery. Take a look, Planet X bikes. If you don't know Planet X, you tend to have to buy what they've got in stock rather than what you went on there to buy, but it will be a very, very good bargain. Most of us British people know. So Holdsworth Campagnolo with a stellar lineup of the day, and bear in mind that stellar lineups in Britain weren't quite as international as they are today. But Holdsworth Campagnolo boasting A good team: Bob Addy, Les West, Reg Barrett, Dave Nee, and Roger Newton. So moving on to Bantel. Now the star name in there, if you know anything about your British cycling history from that era, Vin Denson really was a top British star, and remembered to this day and quite often spoken about. Vin Denson, the star of the Bantel team there. And look, they've got 8 riders. And this is one of the things that you've got to recognise here, that there weren't that many professional racers in the British scene in those days. And there are a number of reasons for this. Historically, road racing had been banned in the UK, and the only racing that was really going on was the clandestine time trials, which were very, very underground. All the time trial courses today in Britain still have secret code names so that nobody knew where they were. And the reason time trials prevailed in Britain, even though road racing was banned, was because if you're riding a time trial solo and anybody stops you and accuses you of racing, you're on your own and you just say, no, I'm out for a bike ride. And of course, you know, in pre-war, pre-Second World War times, people actually wore ordinary clothes while cycle racing, certainly in Britain anyway. So it up until the Second World War, there wasn't really a history of cycle racing. Now we're turning left here and we're about to go under the a similar bridge to the one where the Great Train Robbery was. It's the same railway line, of course. Here we are. This is the next bridge along from where the actual robbery happened. So we're heading westwards now at the top of the course. We're going back to British road racing. What we had was the National Cyclists Union, who opposed road racing, and they were the governing body. And during the war, to boost morale, some cycle races were put on, and this led eventually to the creation of the British League of Racing Cyclists. Now, the British League of Racing Cyclists and the National Cyclists Unions obviously had differing views of whether you should race or not, and then of course there were cycling time trials, who were the third group who ran all the time trials, who were quite happy as long as nobody noticed what they were up to. As we see this wonderful picture of the Falcon team from the day in a rather fetching, classic-looking kit. That should be reissued by somebody. So, in 1959, after a lot of negotiations and bickering and all sorts of things, the two groups united to recreate the National Cycling Federation, which is now called British Cycling, it's the British Cycling Federation, which is now British Cycling. And finally things were unified, and over those years we began to get some British cyclists. Now this actually led to British cyclists making it over to the continent and featuring the Tour de France. They weren't the first, but we shall come back to that in a moment. In the meantime, these are the rest of the teams. Now, I don't mean to dismiss the rest of the team, but the interesting thing you'll notice here is that there are professional racers who ride for a team, but they are the only professional in the event, in that team. There's only one rider in there. I'm not sure of all the qualification reasons. Love the teams in their Geoffrey Butler cycles. I believe that went bust in 2020. Geoffrey Butler Cycles is just an iconic South London bike shop. Such a shame that one's gone. Some great names from the past. But interesting, isn't it, that professional riders were riding solo. As I say, there might have been a qualification criteria, I don't know. But very different to today's British National Championships, shall we say. So as we've discussed earlier, Great Britain in the Tour de France. We didn't have too many riders in there. Brian Robinson broke the mould in the 1950s. But in 1967, they did actually allow national teams as opposed to trade-sponsored teams. Apparently this suited Tom Simpson because he felt that British national team might support him rather more than Peugeot Cycles might do with their own national interests. And anyway, Britain had this team and it submitted an entry to the 1967 Tour de France, which was the year where national teams competed rather than trade teams, as I said. And the team lineup here: Michael Wright, going from left to right. Michael Wright was really not actually British, but he fitted some nationality criteria, so got in. Tommy Simpson now, probably Britain's greatest ever rider, certainly before the sort of 2000s. And of course there is a Tom Simpson Memorial on Mont Ventoux where he died during the Tour de France. Arthur Metcalfe, another famous name if you follow British cycling. Colin Lewis, who was actually in this race, and as we've said, he's well known to people in the West Country in the UK. Bill Lawry, we'll hear more about him in a moment. Barry Hoban, who was a Tour de France winner himself, not Tour de France winner, Tour de France stage winner himself, and quite well known. Albert Hitchin, Peter Hill, Vin Denson, who was in this race, who we've already mentioned, and Peter Chisman. Not everybody got to the finish, and British riders, it was a bit of a baptism of fire for some of them. But, this was one of the milestones of British cycling. And if you look at this race, our national championships sponsored on these roads by a couple of local cycling clubs where the bloke who runs it sticks his address on the front of the programme. This was a very different era for British cycling. And of course, we would have been proud of those cyclists at that time for making inroads into the Tour de France, something that Britain wasn't associated with at the time. So here we are, this course here in 1969. We're looking at the 1967 British team that got into the Tour de France. We've looked at the 1963 Great Train Robbery. This was the swinging 60s, and we haven't even mentioned the Beatles or the Rolling Stones yet. And I don't think we will, apart from that brief mention there, because this is all about cycling. So back to the race, because as interesting as the history of British cycling is and its development in the post-war era, we're actually here to preview Westley VR Race 3.7. The reason, because we've indulged ourselves in British cycling history a little bit, is because this course is, of course, part of British cycling history. It may not be great in world terms, but it was one of the things that was a milestone towards eventually Britain becoming a world player in cycling. Now, I have, of course, enjoyed having that as a filler because, frankly, the route has been pretty much reasonably flat, slightly undulating, but unremarkable. As pleasant as the weather and the scenery is, and believe you me, I like cycling out here when I'm doing randonnées and audaxes, and this is fantastically great to cycle reasonably fast on because it's a nice speedy road. It doesn't lend itself to too many commentator comments. However, we are now about to change all of that, because what happens here is that we're going to do a sharp left and we suddenly hit Mentmore Hill, which is where I think this race will be decided. So you can see this is the fourth turn on the lap. Third turn on the lap. The fourth turn will be at the finish. And now we're heading towards Mentmore. So we're on that final stretch, and the hill is shortly after this little straight here. So you'll see me avoiding the rumble strips, which I know very, very well from all my randonneuring down here, and the rumble strips get avoided again. As I say, this road in real life can quite often have a headwind, so it's not as fast as it might look, but not always. It was a very pleasant day, luckily, when I went out to film this, so it was decent enough, although, as I say, the wind was slightly against me on this stretch. We're going to go down here, we're going to hit a sharp left and then a sharp right, 90 degrees, both of them. And after that, we start the climb into Mentmore. Now, I have to say, this hill it probably isn't quite a hill. It's essentially two ramps, and it comes in two stages, and you get this little bit of respite in the middle. But make sure you don't ease off too much during the race, during the little bit of respite in the middle, because if somebody attacks there, you could find yourself just far enough behind to never catch up again. And the key here is that once you get over the hill at Mentmore, it is essentially more or less a downhill straight flat all the way to the finish. And in real life, it's a very, very fast ride out of Mentmore down to Cheddington. Now, Cheddington is the finish where we saw those too many roundabouts, you might recall, at the beginning of this, and that's where we're going to finish. And believe you me, it is fast, even with the wind against you. It is a fast bit of road, but it's this climb up to Mentmore that's going to decide everything. So we've just done the left-hand turn I told you of. We're about to do the right-hand turn, and that's where the ramp starts. But the ramp, as I say, is in two bits, and there are bends on it, so you can mark where the bends are if you're sharp here, and when you're actually doing the race, you'll kind of appreciate what's coming next, albeit that RGT provides you with many indicators on the screen anyway. So here we are. You can just see at the end of that road and the sign on the left telling you that there's a bend coming up. So as soon as we swing right here, you'll see the first bit of the ramp in front of you before we do a left-hand turn at the top of that. So this is it. We swing right, and you can see it sort of gradually rises on the first little bit. You can just see it goes up to those trees ahead. Once we get into the trees, that's where the gradient will begin to bite. It's not, as with all our races, these aren't seriously hard hill climbs. They're just designed to be enough to make a difference in the race. You can see the gradient beginning to ramp up a little bit as we go into these trees. This is key. This is probably the hardest bit of the whole climb. The second ramp isn't as hard as the first, but as you can see, it just continues to sort of grate away a little bit here. As I say, it's not slow, but you need to put that extra effort in to get up this ramp. Now, as we get to the top of this ramp, we're going to swing right. We're going to go through a few houses and swing left, and then start climbing again. And the same thing will happen. We'll go up a little ramp and swing right. It's a pretty little village, Mentmore. As I say, probably it's a Mentmore house actually that we're going to pass. You won't actually see it on the video, but there is a big old house here that probably the village is built around the big house. Now you can see I'm slightly slowing down here in real life because this is the little steep bit. Just before the right-hander is where it gets steep. So this is probably the hardest bit of the whole race. Now once we swing right here and get into these houses, you can see it levels off where that car's coming down. So you get this respite, and then you get the second ramp. Believe you me, the second ramp is nothing like as steep as that last bit of the first ramp. Some pretty little houses. They're actually reasonably large, aren't they? So another one of these nice little rural villages that you see around. Now this is not entirely flat, but it feels flat, and you'll see that it just begins to ramp up about now, and you can see the horizon. You can see it's not as steep as the first one, as I alluded before, and where that vehicle's coming the other direction is where we swing right. The last little bit of the climb, and we're going to pass a pub called the Stag, and then it is going to be fast all the way home. And as I say, if you ride this out there in real life, once you pass the pub that we're going to see on the left called the Stag, from there on, boy, you fly. I mean, you really do fly down this road, even if the wind's against you. So here's the pub, the building on the left. You can see the cars parked outside it. That is the Stag, and here we go. This is a steep bit of descent, and what happens here is that you get so much momentum that the flatter bit that you get after the initial descent, you just got so much momentum that you just speed. It is a glorious bit of road to ride in real life, and I hope it's as much fun on RGT. You won't quite have the British scenery. The Mentmore house just to the right of us, you can see where that van's parked. You won't see it on the screen, but there's a big stately home there, and you can see that things are levelled out here, but we keep going fast. Now it's pretty much straight all the way to those Chillington roundabouts, so there's not a lot to report other than that you need to keep going, because this is maybe it's not a sprint here, but everybody's going to be on fire. Just keep your wits about you, don't get left behind, and keep your positioning tight. So who won in 1969? Well, it was Bill Lawry pictured on your screen. Now, Bill Lawry is quite an interesting character. He had been a successful Australian cyclist, and came over to Britain and actually rode in that Tour de France team that we showed you earlier for Britain. But he was actually Australian. I have no idea, because I haven't researched enough, quite how he qualified to ride for Great Britain as an Australian. I'm sure there's a reason, a rationale behind it. We see in modern football, of course, all sorts of riders changing nationalities so they can get in the team of their choice. But a forerunner in that obviously was Bill Lawry from Australia, Brisbane, as I understand it. And anyway, as I say, rode for Britain too. Split loyalties, perhaps. So in second place, we had Dave Nye in the Holdsworth colours, as you can see in there now, looking very, very classic. Absolutely love those colours. They do come from a different era. And in third place, we had Mick Cowley. Now, unfortunately, the picture I've got, well, I say unfortunately, I rather like the Holdsworth colours, so I'm not that bothered. That's Mick Cowley in Holdsworth colours. And in actual fact, Mick Cowley was riding for Carlton Truewell Campagnolo in this particular race, and he finished in third. Well, we wish you lots and lots of luck here in the 2020s, from the 1960s, and lots of cycling history. Let's make some more Westerly 3.7. Good luck, everybody. See you at the start line.